Welcome to Kedem, and I'm very glad to host today Professor Nathan MacDonald, one of the stars of the University of Cambridge. Welcome.
Lovely to be here, Alex.
So we are talking today about Israelite priesthood. What is actually so important about this topic?
Yeah, thank you. So the Israelite priesthood is one of the great institutions of ancient Israel with a very extended history. So quite when its earliest beginnings would be difficult to say, but certainly by the time we get towards into the Second Temple period, and especially towards the end of the Second Temple period, the high priest is one of the, if not the preeminent figure within Second Temple Judaism.
Throughout the history, we have many groups of people who are looking actually how to justify their supremacy, their power, their hegemony. What could you tell us based on the story we have in the Bible?
I think elite groups have always found ways of trying to control resources, trying to move them towards themselves and also to their own supporters. And they've done that in various different ways. Some of that has been done by the use of brute force, by being able to command the loyalty of certain individuals, whether that's bodyguards or armies or troops. But there have also been more subtle ways in which power is accumulated into a centre and then redistributed to a certain degree. That's often been done historically from very early stages, using the use of agricultural resources, bringing them in to a central place, using them as a feast to reward supporters, and in that way resources are circulated within a system, but also power accrues to those who are able to kind of broker those meals and to those feasts. But they've also done it in various other ways, using cultural resources to expand the power and the influence of a hegemonic class. We might think of the way that art is used to portray rulers. We might think of the way that kind of dress and clothing is used. Or we might even think of the way that texts are used to propound a certain kind of picture of a ruling class and portraying a history which justifies their rights to a privileged position within society.
In ancient Israel, the priesthood is definitely defined as a privileged hegemony group. How actually they justify it? The
priests determine that they receive significant resources, and the best sort of resources, the best cuts of meat, and also the best of the agricultural produce. This is done, one of the ways in which this is done in ancient Israel is through the biblical texts. So if we look at the Pentateuch, particularly the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, scholars think that a number of those texts can be attributed to priestly writers, and those texts propound a view of the world in which the world's story is orientated towards the sanctuary of Israel's God. So if we think of how the biblical story starts in Genesis 1, we have an account of God creating the world in 6 days. That seems to be very much have its counterpart at the end of the book of Exodus with the construction of a tent shrine called a tabernacle. And there are just various ways in which those two texts are cross-referenced to one another. So God completes the work of creation, Moses completes the work of the tabernacle using very similar vocabulary, and that creates a coordination between God's creation of the world and this tent shrine, the tabernacle in the wilderness, which highlights the way that the tabernacle in many ways is the centre of the divine plan, and in many ways the centre of the world that God has created. The tabernacle is not only where creation, the story of creation is leading up to, it also establishes it. You know, the service that the priests do in the temple ensures that the universe remains stable upon its foundations. And therefore the work of the priests in the tabernacle is absolutely crucial to the well-being of the universe as well as the well-being of Israel.
Professor MacDonald, but I'm just wondering how we should read and understand the text. Because in the text we have the story of the tabernacle and the beginning of the priesthood. And should I just read it and accept it as kind of history, which leads to the creation of this privileged group of priests, and this is actually the story? Or opposite way, we have already established privileged group of people with hegemony, and they create this story, and they create the history actually to explain why they are the rulers, why they have the privilege and hegemony.
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. So when we read the biblical texts, you're right that right at the beginning, we seem to have from the very origins of Israel, we have this magnificent tent sanctuary, which from our perspective looks like a precursor to the temple. As you'll recall, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, brings them into the wilderness, and at Mount Sinai they receive the law, but they also receive these instructions about how to build this tent sanctuary. So this, it has a sort of an outer courtyard, then you have a tent in that courtyard, which is divided into two separate rooms. There's an altar in front of the tabernacle where sacrifices are offered, and then right in the center of the tabernacle there's a table, there's a small incense altar, there's a candlestick, and then also in the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, there is the most sacred object in ancient Israel. There's the Ark of the Covenant. And this is the dwelling place of God as it's presented in the book of Exodus. So the biblical portrayal as we now have it would present a picture where the tabernacle is there right from the beginning of Israel's history, and the tabernacle goes into the promised land with the people, and eventually it will be replaced by a temple in the times of David and Solomon. However, if we turn to that history as we find it in Joshua and Judges and the books of Samuel and the book of Kings, we rarely encounter any mention of the tabernacle. We find it once in Joshua 22, we find a brief mention of it in David's prayer of thanksgiving in 1 Samuel 7, but the tabernacle is strangely absent. There's good reasons at least to have suspicions that there was no tabernacle in early Israel. And this earlier portrayal of the tabernacle that we find in Exodus is in fact a projection back from the experience of the temple back onto early Israelite history. When does that happen? Well, quite possibly this happens precisely in the time when the temple had been destroyed. So the temple had been destroyed in 587, 586 BCE by the Babylonians, and in the time before the second temple is built, a vision is created of a tabernacle in some ways that of a temple, of a sanctuary that is safe from foreign incursion and foreign destruction. And that's the tabernacle. This idea that actually, even though the temple had been destroyed, that there was still this sort of this tabernacle which in some ways had not been violated because it had been there right at the beginning. And then this becomes the model for, or in some ways partly a model for the second temple. So one of the things that we see with some of these priestly texts in Genesis and Exodus is that they're creating an Israel that is safe from the incursion of foreign powers. We see this not only with the tabernacle, we also see this with the covenant. So we have the problem when we look at the story of Israel that the covenant was broken. Yet if we sort of look at the priestly literature tells us that right at the beginning, God made a covenant with the people that was an eternal covenant, a covenant of circumcision, which could never be broken. So one of the features about the priestly literature is it's creating a new set of possibilities for Israel after the Babylonian destruction by projecting realities right back into Israel's earliest history, but doing so in a novel kind of way that makes them inaccessible to destructions by Assyrians or Babylonians or Persians or whoever the great imperial power is.
Professor MacDonald, could you explain how actually the priesthood managed to transform itself from the important but still subordinate power in the kingdom of Judah and actually to the main principal power in the Hasmonean period?
Gosh, Alex, I wish I had an answer to that. It's a really fine question, and it's an important question, and it's one of the puzzles that I and others are trying to work out. So let's get a sense of what that problem is. So when we turn to the Book of Kings, we see the very last days of the kingdom of Judah. And mention is made not only of the temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, the king is captured, but also the officials are executed. There's a really interesting difference that happens there. There's mention of a chief priest and a second priest. The king is captured trying to escape. This is Zedekiah. He's taken up to the Babylonian camp at Riblah, where he is judged. His sons are executed before his eyes, and then his eyes are put out. So the last thing he sees is his sons being executed. And then he is he's sent off into exile in Babylon. The officials in Jerusalem, the chief guard and the temple officials, seem to have remained at their posts in the city. They were rounded up. They were also taken to Riblah, but they have a different experience. They're just executed. So the chief royal figure at the end of the kingdom seems to be in a distinct position from the officials within the kingdom. They're obviously subordinate. Nebuchadnezzar has a different kind of relationship with the kings of the various kingdoms that he's conquered. They're taken into exile and kept within the court, but the other subordinate officials are executed. So hegemonic power at the end of the kingdom of Judah is firmly in the hands of the king. And as far as we can see, the chief priest in Jerusalem simply has a role within the temple. By the time we turn to the Hasmonean period, we have a very different kind of experience. The Hasmoneans are the first to reclaim the kingship for a native Judahite family. They eventually claim the power of king, but that claim to power is significantly predicated on the fact that they are the high priests. And so the claim to power within Judah, priesthood now seems to be a very important component of that, in the way that it simply wasn't the case 350 years earlier. To be able to claim the throne, you also have to be a priest and the high priest. So there's a very important shift that's happening over these 350 years, and explaining that shift is precisely the challenge. How does that happen? And there have been different scholarly views on that question. That one view was that really quite early on in the Second Temple period, the high priesthood made the claim to be the supreme power or the supreme authority within the province of Yehud, the Persian province of Yehud. We have some very interesting texts in Haggai and Zechariah that talk about Zerubbabel, who is a descendant of David, and talk about Joshua, who is the high priest. And Joshua seems at some point, the texts are quite difficult, but at points it seems that Joshua appears to be given a crown and may even be sort of maybe partly usurping the position of Zerubbabel. As I say, the texts are rather difficult, and there are some challenging questions about whether in fact those texts have developed much later into the Second Temple period. And yet so there are some who have thought that actually the priesthood makes a claim and establishes its authority and its primacy very early in the Second Temple period. The difficulty with that view is that when we look throughout the Persian period, the supreme power and the coercive power within the province of Yehud seems to have been held by Persian governors, or governors appointed by the Persians, people like Nehemiah. So as far as we can see, in reality, in Persian period Yehud, that control, that authority, that coercive power was held not by the priesthood. It was held by governors who, like Nehemiah, were not priests. And so part of the difficulty that we have is determining why is it that in particularly in the 4th century and the 3rd century, the late Persian period and the early Hellenistic period, how is it that priesthood and the high priesthood becomes the status that is most important for claiming hegemonic power in ancient Yehud? And part of our problem there is that our sources are really quite limited. And so the challenge is really being able to explain how that occurred.
So if the story of the tabernacle actually gives us kind of a hint on the Second Temple period, let's go back to the Exodus stories and the tabernacle in the desert. And we have a different actually descriptions of this tabernacle. And how can you relate that to the priesthood ideology or stories of the maybe even Second Temple?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So within the Pentateuch, the tabernacle account is particularly unusual, and at least from my perspective, is very interesting, and particularly interesting to this question about the development of the priesthood. So in many parts of the Pentateuch, we have a text that is relatively stable, or at least we really only have one major version of it, which is the Hebrew Bible that is familiar to many of us, or the Hebrew Bible that sits behind modern translations. What's so very interesting about the tabernacle account within the Pentateuch is that we arguably have 4 different versions of this text. So we have the Hebrew text, which is familiar to us, which tells about how the tabernacle was instructed to Moses upon Mount Sinai, and then how Moses then descends to the people and they construct it. But we also have 3 other versions. So we have some slight differences in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So this is the holy text of the Samaritan community, and the instructions that are given to Moses have some slight alterations where text has been introduced to create a much more exact correspondence between the commandments that Moses has given and his fulfillment of them. So what we see in the Samaritan Pentateuch seems to be a concern that, what God commands on Mount Sinai has to be done exactly. and that correspondence is much closer in the Samaritan Pentateuch than it is in the Masoretic text. But we then have two other texts, and these are significantly more divergent, and their divergences are to be found almost entirely within the account of how the tabernacle was constructed in Exodus 35 to 40. And that's the so one of these is the Old Greek. And the Old Greek describes the construction of the tabernacle with a significant number of differences. The text is quite a bit shorter than the Hebrew. The text reorders the material, and in particular, when we look at the Hebrew text, we see we have an account in which the people construct the tabernacle, the tent, and then they make the furniture that is to go inside the tent, and then they make the garments for Aaron and his sons. The order in the Old Greek is really quite different. So the material is ordered, the textual material is ordered by the material out of which the things are made. And there are two major craftsmen. One is called Bezalel and one is called Oholiab. Oholiab is mentioned first with a number of Israelite helpers, and they construct all the fabrics. So that includes the vestments of Aaron, and that includes the tabernacle tent itself. And then Bezalel constructs all the metal items. So we have a significant difference between the way that the material is ordered, as well as the fact that the description of the material being made is in many places considerably shorter in the Greek. And then finally we've got an Old Latin text, and this Old Latin text is quite close to the Greek, but does also have its own divergences. This is an Old Latin text. It's quite a tricky text. It was discovered in a library in Munich. It was originally probably copied maybe in France or in Italy. It was eventually moved to a monastery just outside Munich. But it's a manuscript of the Old Latin text of Exodus. And the Old Latin text means before Jerome. So it's an earlier text, but the manuscript was repurposed at some point in the medieval period, and it was overwritten with the text of the Vulgate. So we have an Old Latin Bible text underneath, and then that was sort of scraped away to reuse the manuscript, and it was overwritten with a Vulgate text of Ezra and Daniel and a few other bits and pieces. So it's what scholars call a palimpsest. So we've got a text that was overwritten, but when it was overwritten, the manuscript was bigger than they wanted, and so they cut it in order to make it to the size they wanted, which means that we have, if we're looking at the text underneath, the Old Latin text, we've got a column, and then half a column, and half a column is being cut away and lost. And then you turn over the page, you've got half a column, and a column, and then a column and half a column, and so on. So we've got a text that's quite difficult to reconstruct. But when we do reconstruct it, it is again somewhat divergent. We have an account of a tabernacle with some interesting differences. In particular, the tabernacle seems to be slightly closer to a building, has some building features about it. So it's sort of halfway between a tabernacle and a temple. But also there have been some very interesting changes to the interior design. In the Holy of Holies, instead of having the ark with the atonement cover on top and the cherubim are on pillars. And then when you go into the outer room, there are seraphim in the outer room. So you've got cherubim in the inner room and you've got seraphim in the outer room. What's going on there? It looks rather like what we have in this manuscript is that the tabernacle is being orientated somewhat towards the temple. So partly it's being aligned a little bit towards Kings, the account of Solomon's temple, but also, of course, to the account of the temple in Isaiah 6. You remember Isaiah 6, when he receives the prophetic vision, he sees the he sees the temple, he sees God in the temple, and he sees seraphim. And so these seraphim have been placed into the tabernacle in the outer room. So there are some significant changes. And so we've got these 4 different versions of the tabernacle account, which is something that we just don't have for any other part of the Pentateuch. What that allows us, well, I mean, that shows us a number of interesting things. First of all, it allows us to try and use these 4 different texts to try and reconstruct a little bit of how their text developed. And I would argue that the basic order within which these texts belong are probably the Old Greek is the oldest, and the Old Latin is a sort of slight divergence from it with some extra features. The Hebrew text that we're familiar with is actually later. One of the reasons that we know that, well, there are 2 reasons that we could say that we know that. One of them is that the text is longer, and that's typically longer texts are a sign that the text has developed over time. Scholars normally prefer the shorter text. That's not an absolute rule, but it is a helpful rule of thumb. But the second reason for preferring the Old Greek is that when we look at the Hebrew text is very tidy, very neat, very ordered. One of the ways we see that in the tabernacle account, the writer is very fond of listing the different parts of the tabernacle. So Moses gets told that he has to make the ark, make the lampstand, make the incense altar, make the table, make the curtains. The writer likes to list these things, and he lists them 4 or 5 times. In the Hebrew text, the order of those items is always the same. And it seems that they have been always put in the same systematic order. If we turn to the Greek text, it's a much more messy affair. Now, typically scholars would say that the text that has been made much more consistent is the later text. So there are a few reasons for thinking that the Old Greek reflects an earlier development of the text, and then the Hebrew text, and then probably latest the Samaritan Pentateuch. When were those texts composed? When did this development of the tabernacle account happen? I think the beginnings of this literature, the beginning of the tabernacle is probably to be found in the Neo-Babylonian period, in the time of the exile, when there was no temple. This is when towards the end of that period is when a number of scholars tend to date the priestly literature, of which the tabernacle account is a part. And so that's seems to be our beginnings. If we turn to the scrolls from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find at the scrolls of Qumran, we find a text that is very close to the Samaritan Pentateuch. So by the time we get to the 2nd century BCE or the 1st century BCE, we already have the text that we know, or something like the text we know from the Samaritan Pentateuch. And we also have a very early text from Qumran, which seems to show a text that's fairly close to the Hebrew text that we now know, but with some changes. So it looks to me as though over a period of about 250, 300 years, from around 500 BCE, around 520 BCE, around the time of the end of the exile, to around 220 BCE, the time when the Qumran texts are being written, so around 300 years, we have the tabernacle account being developed in these different ways. Using that textual information, and also some of the features that we find in the tabernacle account, I think we can make some moves towards reconstructing a little bit of the history of how this text developed as it was copied and written and developed from scribe to scribe to scribe over the Second Temple period.
So all these tabernacle stories, how they can shed a light on this Second Temple priesthood?
Yeah, so I think what we have in the tabernacle accounts over this 300-year period is that the tabernacle account becomes, I might almost think of it as a sort of sandbox for thinking through or for projecting ideas of what the priesthood wants to be happening. They're projecting this into the distant past, into the authoritative past, associating it with the figure of Moses, and this is what they want the world to look like. This is how they want the cult, the Israelite cult, to appear, and how they want it to operate. And so we see. So I want to point out sort of two ways in which we might see the tabernacle account embedding the power of the priesthood and beginning to create an intellectual world, we might say, where the primacy of the priesthood is being seen. The first of those is the vestments, the high priestly dress. The high priestly dress, which we find a description of in Exodus 28, very detailed description of the uniform that Aaron has to wear. When we read the priestly literature, scholars will, you'll often read it in the scholarly literature, that the priestly literature in the Old Testament is very, we might almost say coy about telling you what the significance of the cult is. So, for example, you turn to the accounts of the sacrifices in Leviticus 1. What's the point of the burnt offering? Frustratingly, the text doesn't really tell you. You have all these rituals, but nobody explains what these rituals are for. If we look at the tabernacle account, we would say that's also true. So we have mention of the Ark of the Covenant, we have mention of the table, we have mention of the lampstand, but there's no text that sort of explains, this is the significance of it. In much later texts, we often get that. These objects within the tabernacle or within the temple become, of great interest to later interpreters, whether that's the letter Aristeas or whether that's Philo or Josephus or Christian or rabbinic interpreters. But the Bible is surprisingly unhelpful, we might say, in telling us what the significance of these objects is. That changes completely when we get to Exodus 28. So to Exodus 25, 26, 27, we've had the description of all these objects in the tabernacle. Their significance has not been explained. On the other hand, the vestments that Aaron wears are absolutely suffused with meaning. Every single item that he's wearing is given some sort of significance. The band that he wears, the band that he wears on his forehead is so that he can bear the iniquities before the Lord. He's got bells to ring so that the Lord can hear him. He's got a breastplate on the front so that the names of Israel are borne before the Lord into the tabernacle. So every single thing, every item of which he wears is given a significance. So his whole body is kind of full of meaning. Well, what's the purpose of that? Well, as you read the tabernacle account, as you've read the priestly literature all the way from Genesis 1 to Exodus 28, it's really clear what's the most important thing in Israel's cultic life. It's the high priest and what he wears. Without the high priest, there is no representation of Israel into God's presence. It's only through the high priest that the people are going to be represented. So that's one way in which we see the tabernacle accounts embedding or seeking to give an account of why the high priest is so important. Let me give you another example. And this is a very interesting one because, I mean, when we've looked at the vestments, we've got a sort of standard picture of hierarchy. Okay, the high priest is top of the pile. Something very interesting happens with these workers with Bezalel and Oholiab who make the tabernacle. Bezalel is described as, he's the one who has to make everything. It's kind of surprising when we read the tabernacle account, this is surprising, because when we've read Exodus 25 to 31, when we're given the instructions to Moses, we think Moses is going to make it. And then suddenly we get sprung on us that in fact Bezalel and Oholiab are going to make it. The text struggles with this actually. This is clearly a problem for those who are writing the text because, you know, how do you harmonize these two accounts? Well, the way that they do that actually appears in Exodus 39 and 40. Bezalel and Oholiab make everything, but it's like a little bit like IKEA flat packs, and they hand it over to Moses, and Moses puts it together. So they find a way of harmonizing these two different perspectives. But if we turn to Bezalel and Oholiab, Bezalel is described as filled with the Spirit of God. He has the Ruach Elohim. That's a really surprising description. You know, the priests are never described as filled with the Spirit of God. That's quite high status. You know, this is the Spirit of God. This is the Spirit of God that was first mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, the Spirit of God that was moving over the waters before God begins the act of creation. So, you know, this is pretty high credentialing. And Bezalel is a Judahite, so he belongs to the Davidic family. On the other hand, we might say that Bezalel's kind of been brought down a peg or two as well, because he's only a maker. You know, he's not the supreme figure. The high priest is the supreme figure, but Bezalel is given a certain amount of authority and importance. I mean, one of the ways in which we see him being brought down is that the anointing, so in ancient Israel, the king was the one who was anointed. So we would expect Bezalel would be anointed, he's the Judahite. No more. The high priest is now going to be anointed. No longer is the Davidite going to be anointed, it's going to be the high priest. But the priests are giving Bezalel and the Israelite artisans a certain amount of, we might say, power, a certain amount of credentialing. And they're even sort of saying, if you like, you know, there's stuff that we can't do. I suspect that there's probably a deliberate contrast being made between Bezalel and Aaron. So what's the verb that's used of Bezalel the entire time? He's the one who does these things. Asa, he does, he makes, he does. That's what he does. And the contrast is being made to Aaron. Aaron, Exodus 32, what does he do? Moses goes up the mountain, Aaron is left down with all the people, and the people say to him, you know, Moses is gone, don't think he's coming back. You know, can you do something for us? Can you make a god for us? So Aaron makes something. What does he make? Well, he makes a golden calf. You know, the implications of the story seem clear. You don't want the priest to be making stuff. When the priests make stuff, it all goes wrong. You know, if the priests have calluses on their hands and they roll up their sleeves and they start making stuff, you know, it all gets horribly messy. So the Israelite artisans and Bezalel and Oholiab are given a certain amount of credentialing. They are given, you know, they can do this artistry stuff that the priests are not claiming to do. So there's a handing over of some sort of power. But it is clearly a kind of hierarchical form of power because they're being given authority over these areas whilst also kind of saying, well, actually priesthood is above artisans. You know, this is stuff that we can't do. You can do it better than we can, but we're still in the top position. So we have a much more kind of complex notion of power going on here, where power is both, you know, what's interesting, power is both being dissipated and shared and brought into a hierarchy. Very often this either becomes descriptions of sort of hierarchy or democratization. And what I'm trying to do is find a way that moves actually between these two. It's neither, there is hierarchy there, undoubtedly. There's priests come above ordinary Israelites, no question. But power is also being dispersed in very interesting ways. So what we see in the tabernacle account is the creation of a story in the past being associated with the authoritative past, with Moses and Aaron and all these great figures in the past. But in order to cement and establish the power of the priests and the nature of that power, and some of that power is offloaded to others, but that's not a disinterested process. The priests are interested in doing that because they're also accruing the most important, prestigious power, the power of the cult, to themselves.
So, what we have discussed with you so far and learned from you about the priesthood, how we can apply this to the Persian and Hellenistic period?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It seems to me that we have a limited number of texts that tell us about this period and tell us about the development or give us insights into the development of the priesthood. And there's often been a slight danger of using those texts as, we might say, a sort of mirror of what's going on historically. They just reflect out. We read them, and if we see the priests taking on more of a position of power, we assume that they are, this is the change that has happened, and the texts are now reflecting this. Some of those textual developments are happening because they're being influenced by events in the real world, but some of them are sort of following a logic of the text. But that text, the text is then having an impact on the world of Second Temple Judaism. So in many ways, I'm trying to move away from a position where changes to the priesthood and to the temple cult take place and are then reflected in the text, or simply that they're happening in the text and then changing the real world. But actually there's a much more kind of creative dialogue happening between the two. In some ways, this is what makes the text particularly challenging, and reconstructing this history particularly hard, is that it's often very difficult to disentangle these two flows that are happening between the social and political and cultural reality of Second Temple Judaism and the textual material. These texts are being developed during the Persian period and into the Hellenistic period, and these texts are themselves creating the conditions in which the priest could claim hegemonic power. Now, in many ways, we might look, there's one way of reading Genesis and Exodus and saying that the high priest's authority and his significance occurs within the cult. He's the preeminent figure who goes into the tabernacle and represents on his vestments, on his breastpiece, represents the people to God, so that the people are brought into God's presence and God sees their names and he remembers them for good. I think it's probably possible to see how that then feeds into and generates an idea that the priest is absolutely crucial to the nature of the world order, and that means not only the cult, but that his prerogatives, his power extend beyond that to the nation as a whole, and to, in many ways, also to the world as a whole. And that the fact that he is representing the people in the cult places him into a preeminent position vis-a-vis the people that he is not just one Israelite amongst many, not just the most important person in the cult, but he is the representative of the people par excellence, and therefore by dint of that, ought to exercise hegemonic power, and it's that is sitting behind the Hasmonean claims that they have the right to rule the people because they are themselves the priests and they hold the high priestly office.
Professor Nathan MacDonald, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.